So welcome, of course, and we'll start off with our bracha, as per usual. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And we begin a new book, the fifth and last of the 5 books of the Torah, the book of Dvarim. We actually had started it a year ago, or perhaps even more. And so we're going to continue where we left off. And just to remind you at this point that the book of Dvarim is quite unique in that it consists of 3 speeches that Moses gives to the Jewish people prior to his departure from this world. And it is like a great example of what is called an ethical will. And in it, he basically reviews many of the laws, but also gives them a lot of encouragement as to how he wants them to be. And that's the nature of an ethical will, where someone says to the family who's passing on, a patriarch will say, you know, how he encourages them to live lives that are ethical and faithful and stuff like that. So we're going to go into the share right now. I may have to do this more than once. Let's see, here we are. And this is where we are. And we're talking about how Moses is reviewing with them. This is still chapter 1, as you can see, how he is setting up the society, essentially that it has to be founded on justice, on having courts that are reliable, and even having, he talks about shotrim, which are officers that will enforce the decisions of the judges. So here is where he's saying this. Moses is telling them, "Va'atzaveh et shoftechem," and I commanded your judges, ba'et hahi lemor, at that time, ba'et hahi, at that time, lemor, saying, shamoa, hear out, listen, bein achechim, between your brothers, literally, right? Ushvatatem tzedek, and judge them with righteousness. Bein ish uvein achiv, between a man and his brother. Uvein geiro, and between his, well, geiro generally on a pshat level, simple level means proselyte. In other words, someone who may not be a native Jew, you might say, or a born Jew. And that would be the pshat, as I would understand it, of this. But we're going to see how the tradition, excuse me, I'm trying to just get it to be a size that's manageable, understands this in various and different ways. So let's take a look at the Rashi on this. I commanded your judges, instructed your judges. This is from the Sifrei. Amarti lahem, I said to them, Hevu mitunim badim, be deliberate in judgment. In other words, you have to take your time, be patient, be slow, be thoughtful about any judgment, any case that comes to you. And Rashi gives some examples. Imba din lepranecha pam achat, shtayim v'shalosh. If the same case comes before you 1 time, a 2nd time, a 3rd time, al tomar, don't say, kvar ba din ze lefanai, I've already had to judge this kind of case, pa'amim harbe, lots of times. So since you now have had this case, you simply move on and go quickly. Don't do that. Ella, but you nosim v'notnim bo, you have to, literally means, carry and give amongst it, meaning give and take and discuss it. So in other words, saying that each case, even if it's exactly the same as a previous case, requires argumentation and debate and discussion. Well, partially that every case is important when it comes to judging it. And then you never know that there might be some circumstance, if you're careful about it, that may alter the ultimate judgment. Please excuse me 1 second. Thank you. Ba'et hahi, at that time. Mishe minitim, from the moment that I appointed them, amarti lahem, I said to them, ein achshav keshele avar. Now is not like the past. In other words, when you are appointed as a judge, your life is no longer the same, as he's going to be specific, right? You can't behave as you did in the past. L'shavar, in the past, heyitim bereshut atzmechem. You were under your own recognizance, right? You were in your own place. You permission, literally, under your own permission. Achshav, but now, hare atim meshubadim latzibur. But now you are subject, you're obligated to the public. In other words, very literal, thoughtful translation of the term public servant and what that implies. That you have to have the public in mind when you make your decisions. You can't just think about what's to your own benefit. Shama. So he says, let me make sure. So it's actually shamoa, right? Shamoa. And he says this grammatical form, lashon hove. In other words, it is, nowadays we would call hove the present tense, but it means continual, it's happening, it's present, in other words, constant. And the audent in French, Old French, and herend, be listening. And kamo, and he gives an example, zachor, remember, v'shamor, and guard, referring to the 10 Commandments, where it's talking about the Shabbat, and it's saying zachor in one version, and shamor in the other version in Deuteronomy, to be aware of constantly. Uvein gero, so literally it would mean gero, we'd understand, remember, as someone who is not necessarily of Jewish extraction, right? But the Sifrei really analyzes carefully the Hebrew here and what its meanings are potentially. Ze Baal Dimo, so this is referring to his interlocutor, the one who's coming, I believe here it means the one who's opposing him. She'oger alav devarim. Oger, that's where he's getting the goror, the one who gathers about him matters. Now, Shira Beth, I'm glad you're here. Can Baal Din mean like an attorney? Is that another meaning of it?
The current term is orech din.
Aha.
I guess I was guessing that Baal Din was someone who has a case, so who goes to court with a case.
Right, against you. I think that's what he's saying. Because remember, it's between him and this ger, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one interpretation. And this is also from Sanhedrin, page 7. Davar acher, another interpretation, uvein gero, right? Af al iske dira. So lagur can mean to dwell, right? So gero, they're understanding, they're taking this word ger, and they're looking at the various meanings that it has and how it might apply to what Moses is saying here. So he says, regarding matters of domicile, living quarters, and you'll see what he's saying here. Ben chalukat achim, whether we're talking about the division of inheritance, afilu ben tanur lekirayim, whether it has to do with being concerned about the distinction of a tanur, which is an oven, a kind of an oven, and a kirayim was a stove, right? And it's kirayim because it had a double top to it. There's actually a chapter in Masechet Shabbat that talks about a kira and the distinction between a kira and a tanur. A tanur tends, at least back in ancient times, it had to do, they were made essentially out of clay, I would imagine, possibly out of metal. But the tanur was a box-shaped stove, and a kira was actually a tanur was actually a pyramid shape, I believe, so the heat was really concentrated, and the kira had a shape of a box. But the point is, he's saying here, down to the last detail, if this is something that is in dispute between people and you are asked to judge this, you have to be very deliberate about it, very concerned, and show concern about it, and be careful about it, because a judgment is going to be made. Lo takiru panim b'mishpat, do not show, in other words, literally it means do not recognize faces, b'mishpat, in the judgment, in the case. So basically it means you shouldn't show preference when you're making a judgment, when you're at a trial. Kakaton kagadol, whether it's little or it's great, tishma'un, you should listen just the same way to one that is small as one that is great. And it's, as you can see, it's a general phrase, and we're going to look at various ways in which one can interpret this. And lo taguru mipnei ish, you shall not, literally it means be afraid of anyone, from any person. You shouldn't show fear. And nowadays, where we hear that people are actually being threatened when they're making decisions and judgments, we can certainly understand the validity of this phrase. That people, when they are judged, sometimes if they're judged negatively, or they see a judgment that isn't in agreement with theirs, they can act in threatening ways. And he says, Ki hamishpat lelohimhu, because the judgment belongs to God. It is God's. You're acting on God's behalf in this particular case when you act in this deliberate, careful kind of way. V'hadavar asher yikshe michen, and as for the matter which is too difficult for you, takrivun elai, bring it to me, ushemativ, and I will hear it out. So, some interesting stuff to look at here. Lo takiru panim b'mishpat, right? You shouldn't show preference in judgment. Again, this is very old, material text which Rashi is citing. So this is very interesting. This is referring to one who appoints judges, Lohoshiv Hadayanim, to set up the judges. So this is referring to someone who's responsible for selecting judges. Shelo Yomar, he shouldn't say, Ish Ploni, this particular person, Na'er, he is pleasant, or Gibor, or he's very stalwart, he is a strong person, or Shivenu Dayan. Okay. I will set him up as a judge, Ish Ploni, or another example, so-and-so Krovi, he's a relative of mine, or Shivenu Dayan, I will set him up as a judge, Ba'ir, in the city, Bahu Eino Baki, but any of these particular people is not an expert, Badinim. He doesn't understand the law. He's not an expert at the law. Nimtza mechayev et hazakai, and you can find that as a result of his being ignorant of the laws, okay, he can hold guilty one who is innocent. Umaske et hachayav, and he can hold innocent one who is in fact guilty. And it can also mean someone who owes money, okay, and is required to pay back money if he stole stuff, and chayav means that he is owing something, right? Maleh ani al I, this is Moses saying in God's name, Ma'aleh ani, I hold such a person, al mi sheminehu, on the one who appointed the judge, ke'ilu hikir panim badim, as if he himself is showing preference in the judgment itself. And of course, we all know, especially here in the system that we have in the United States, where people are elected, etc., that the responsibility becomes quite significant when we see the results of these elections. Kekaton kegadol tishma'un, whether small or large, you shall hear it out. And this is from Tractate Sanhedrin in the Talmud, page 8. Sheyehei chaviv alav, that one should as enjoy as much din shel pruta, in other words, or as important to this person, or precious to this person, a judgment involving a pruta. A pruta is like a farthing, it's like a penny, okay? Kedin, just as a judgment involving shel me'ah, 100 pieces of shekels, pieces of silver, etc. Shel me'ah mana, 100 mana pieces of this weight of gold. So it could be a terribly, a case involving a lot of money, or even just a small amount. Shouldn't make a difference. She'im, and in this way, she'im kadam uva lefanecha, that if the one of a penny comes before you first, lo tesalkenu la'acharon, you shouldn't say, well, it only involves a penny, so I'll just set it back and put it later on in my calendar. Davar acher. So interesting takes on the pshat of the verses here. Just really carefully analyzing and sifting out layers of meaning in what we're reading here. Davar acher, another interpretation, kakaton gagadol tishma'un, that referring to large and small, you shall hear out. Ketargumor, like the targum, meaning shelo tomar, that you shouldn't say ze ani, this particular person is poor. Ta'anihu, he is poor. V'chavero ashir, and his fellow, the person who has the case against him, is wealthy. Mitzvah lefarnaso, and because it's a mitzvah for the wealthy person to make sure that the person has parnasah, has a livelihood. Aske et ani, in the judgment, I will hold the poor person innocent or clear. V'nimtza mitparnes b'nikiyut, and so consequently, he will be, in fact, his livelihood will be given to him, and I will consider to be a just case. And in this case, of course, the poor person has stolen or something like that, and is in fact the one who is to be held guilty, and you can't do that. You can't look at the person's circumstances and say, oh, I can do it this way. Davar acher, another way of looking at this. Shelo tomar, you shouldn't say as a judge, hey ach ani pogem bichvodo. Here is this wealthy person or this honorable person. How can I hold against him, rule against him, and I'm going to hurt his honor. I'm going to dishonor him publicly. Bichvodo shel ashir zeh, of this wealthy, prominent person, bishvil dinar, for 1 dinar. How can I take this and treat this person this way? Askenu, I will hold him in the judgment. I will hold him innocent, achshav, now, ukeshiyetze lachutz, and when he leaves the court, omar lo, I'll tell him, ten lo, you need to give to the other person, she'ata chayav lo, because you owe that person. So what's done publicly? These have actually huge implications on a pragmatic level, right? The implications of judgment and making sure that justice, in fact, is carried out. And this is considering those particular issues. And of course, the fact that these thoughts are here and are really, millennia old is telling us how current, in fact, some of this material actually is. Lo taguru mipnei ish, literally it means you shall not fear, right? You shall not show fear from any person. And again, this is a sifrei. Lo tira'u, he's explaining the word taguru here as meaning do not fear. He's giving the more common word for fear. Davar acher, another way of looking at this. Lo taguru, in other words, taking this word taguru, right? And we've had this already when we were looking at the word ger as meaning someone who collects. Lo tachnis devarecha, but in this case it means do not gather in, do not contain your words mipnei ish, on account of a person. In other words, what he's saying is don't give the full judgment. Lashon, and what this means is, comes from another example in Proverbs chapter 10, Oger Bakayetz, where a verse says, one who gathers in during the summer. So when you have a judgment to make, you can't, play careful on that in the sense of not saying all the judgment that needs to be said. Ki hamishpat lelohimhu, because the judgment belongs to God, And this is the implication of this. Ma she'ata notel mizeh, that which in a case where you take from one person, shelo kadin, which is not appropriate. In other words, if you don't judge carefully and you have someone have to pay up whatever, whether it's a fine or compensation, ata maskikeni lachazor lo, you are now obligating me as a God of justice to return to this person. Lachazir lo, to return to this person. Nimtza, and consequently, shehitita alai hamishpat, you have, well, I looked it up in Jastra, as you can see, and the way they understood it was that it has to do with perverting judgment. You have made the judgment, but here it means, I think, you have turned the judgment against me because I'm going to have to take care of it now. Tikruvun elai. So remember, Moses says to them, if you find a case too difficult, you should bring it to me and I'll take care of it. And we'll see how this is understood. Because on the surface, we could say, well, he's just trying to be helpful, but that is not the way in which the Sifrei understands the possible meaning. Al davar zeh, because he said this, because Moses said this, implying that he was going to know how to take care of it, right? Nistalek mimenu mishpat benot Tzlofchad. For that reason, the judgment regarding the daughters of Tzlofchad, which we just read in the previous Parsha and in a couple of Parshiot before that. Remember, Tzlofchad only had daughters, and they were talking about inheritance, and that their inheritance normally went to the sons, and Tzlofchad only had daughters, and they came and they asked him the situation, and he had to consult with God to get the answer. And this is saying, because Moses assumed that he'd be able to answer any difficult cases, he wasn't able to answer this case. And he says, V'chein Shmuel, and we find again in the case of the prophet Samuel, Amar l'Shaol, he said to Saul, in Samuel 1, chapter 9, Anochi haroeh, I am the seer. In other words, the one who can see past, right, the obvious. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, said the Holy One, blessed be He, to him, Chayecha, by your life, meaning taking an oath. God was taking an oath. She'ani modiacha, I'm going to let you know, she'ein ata ro'eh, that you are no seer. Ve'emata hodi'o, and at what point did he let Samuel know just how limited his ability was to see past the superficial? Kesheba limshoach et David, when he came, he was told by God to go and anoint David, and God didn't tell him that it was David. That was the situation. And of course, Jesse had a number of sons, and Samuel saw Vayar et Eliav. He saw Eliav, the son Eliav, Vayomer ach neged Hashem Meshicho, and he said at that time, here is his God's anointed appearing before him. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and at that time the Holy One, blessed be He, said to him, Velo amarta anochi haroeh, did you not say, I am, that is speaking about himself, Samuel speaking about himself, I'm the one who sees? Al tabet el mar'ehu, he says, don't look at Eliav's outward appearance. And of course, finally, when Samuel has to, what happens in that story, and it's a very lovely piece of literature, David happens to be out pasturing his father's flock, so he's not around at the time when Samuel sees the other sons, and not one of them is appropriate according to God. God is communicating to Samuel, not one of them, and he has to say to Jesse, do you have another son? And at that point, they go and summon David, and of course, he's the one who's selected. And I'm happy to take any questions at this point. So let's stop right here. So
it's such a Cinderella story.
Yes, it is, isn't it? That is interesting. I never thought of it like that, but you're right. I know it is in a way.
Or yeah.
I think it appeals to us.
Do you have any other daughters? Yes. Do you have any other sons? Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to stop the share here. So lovely to have all of you here. So this is it for now, and please God, we will continue tomorrow. I'll stop the recording.